Mary Daly, a trailblazing radical feminist philosopher and theologian, left an indelible mark on feminist thought with her groundbreaking work Gynecology, the Meta-Ethics of Radical Feminism. Published in 1978, this influential text dismantles patriarchal structures, myths, and rituals, offering a fierce critique of how women have been systematically oppressed across cultures and history. Gynecology not only exposes the violent underpinnings of patriarchal practices, but also serves as a radical call for women to reclaim their autonomy, identity, and spiritual power. Central to Daly's work is the concept of the Metapatriarchal Journey, a transformative process she invites women to embark upon. This journey represents an exploration beyond patriarchal norms, where women confront the forces that have silenced and controlled them, enabling a rediscovery of their authentic selves. Through this journey, Daly encourages readers to actively resist patriarchal conditioning, reclaim their voices, and create a space where female identity can be redefined on their own terms. In doing so, Gynecology stands as a manifesto for women's liberation, challenging us to envision a world beyond patriarchal confines and inviting us to participate in a revolutionary process of self-discovery and empowerment. Structure of the book. Mary Daly's Gynecology is divided into 3 main passages, each representing a stage in the journey toward understanding and dismantling patriarchal oppression. 1. The first passage, Processions. In this section, Daly introduces the idea of processions, where she examines how patriarchal myths and narratives have been used to deceive and control women. She delves into how these myths have historically dismembered women's sense of self and identity. Through an analysis of Western and Christian symbolism, Daly exposes how patriarchal ideologies have been deeply embedded in religious and cultural narratives, mystifying women's oppression and justifying their subjugation. 2. The second passage, the pseudo-ritual syndrome. This passage is the core of Daly's analysis, where she explores the pseudo-ritual syndrome, the ritualistic reenactment of violence against women throughout history. Daly examines various practices such as Indian suttee, the burning of widows, Chinese foot binding, African genital mutilation, European witch burnings, and American gynecology. By drawing connections between these seemingly disparate practices, Daly illustrates how patriarchal societies have consistently inflicted violence on women's bodies as a means of control, reinforcing the idea of women's inferiority and objectification across different cultures. 3. The third passage, Gynecology, Spinning New Time and Space. In the final passage, Daly shifts from deconstructing patriarchal oppression to envisioning a new, liberated reality for women. This section represents a transformative journey where women reclaim their power and redefine their existence. Daly discusses the processes of spooking, sparking, and spinning, which symbolize exorcising patriarchal influences, igniting female friendships, and weaving new narratives of womanhood. Here, Daly invites women to engage in the act of spinning, creating their own time, space, and language, free from patriarchal constraints, and to reconnect with their authentic selves and with each other. This 3-part structure guides readers through a journey of understanding how patriarchy operates, the ways it has violently oppressed women, and how women can reclaim their power and redefine their lives beyond patriarchal definitions. The first passage, Processions. Chapter 1, Deadly Deception, Mystification Through Myth. In this chapter, Mary Daly embarks on an exploration of how myths have been deliberately constructed and propagated by patriarchal societies to mystify, control, and ultimately oppress women. She argues that myths have been one of the most effective tools used by patriarchy to impose limitations on women's identities, freedoms, and perceptions of themselves. These myths are not merely stories, but powerful frameworks that dictate societal norms, values, and behaviors, shaping the way women see themselves and how they are perceived by others. Daly examines the origins of various myths, revealing how they have been crafted by male-dominated institutions, such as religion, literature, and cultural traditions, to maintain control over women. She points out that these myths are designed to appear as universal truths, passed down through generations and ingrained into societal consciousness, making them seem unquestionable. They serve as the lenses through which women view themselves, reinforcing the idea that their value, role, and purpose are defined by men. One key myth Daly deconstructs is the femme fatale, a concept that portrays women as dangerous, seductive, and deceitful. The femme fatale archetype serves to warn against female sexuality, presenting it as something to be feared and controlled. By positioning women as inherently threatening or manipulative when they express their sexuality, this myth not only justifies patriarchal control over women's bodies, but also conditions women to view their own sexuality with suspicion or shame. This construct is pervasive in various cultures and continues to manifest in modern depictions of women in media, literature, and even societal expectations of female behavior. Another myth Daly analyzes is the virgin, which represents purity, innocence, and passivity. This ideal places women on a pedestal only if they conform to an image of chastity and obedience, stripping them of their autonomy and complexity. Women who fail to meet this ideal are often shamed or ostracized, reinforcing the belief that a woman's worth is tied to her sexual purity and submission. Daly illustrates how this myth has been used to control women's sexuality and limit their freedom, forcing them into roles that deny their agency, desires, and individuality. The witch is yet another powerful myth dissected by Daly. Historically, women who deviated from societal norms, those who were knowledgeable, independent, or assertive, were labeled as witches, demonized, and often persecuted. The witch hunts of the past were not merely about superstition, but were systematic efforts to suppress women who threatened patriarchal authority. By branding them as dangerous or evil, patriarchal societies justified their oppression, often through violence and terror. Daly argues that this demonization of women who reject conventional roles continues to shape how assertive, outspoken, or non-conforming women are treated today, silencing their voices and diminishing their power. Daly's analysis extends beyond these specific myths to demonstrate how they interconnect and reinforce each other, creating a complex web that traps women in predefined roles. She emphasizes that these myths are not harmless stories. They function as instruments of power, ensuring that women remain subordinated and disconnected from their true selves. Through this chapter, Daly calls on women to recognize the power of these myths, to question their validity, and to actively reject the narratives that have been imposed on them. By doing so, women can begin the process of reclaiming their identities, freeing themselves from the psychological and emotional chains of patriarchal deception. Chapter 2: Dismemberment by Christian and Post-Christian Myths. In this chapter, Mary Daly turns her attention to the influence of Christian and post-Christian myths on the fragmentation of female identity. She argues that these religious narratives have played a significant role in justifying and perpetuating the subjugation of women, reinforcing their status as inferior, sinful, or incomplete. Daly traces the roots of these myths back to their origins, examining how they have been used to maintain patriarchal control over women's bodies, minds, and spirits. One of the central figures Daly critiques is the biblical Eve, whose story has been used for centuries to blame women for the fall of humanity. According to Christian mythology, Eve's act of eating the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden led to humanity's expulsion from paradise and introduced sin into the world. Daly argues that this narrative has been instrumental in portraying women as the root of evil, temptation, and suffering, thereby justifying their subordination and punishment. This myth perpetuates the idea that women are inherently flawed, untrustworthy, and in need of male guidance to be redeemed. It reinforces a narrative that women's actions, desires, and choices are dangerous and that they must be controlled to prevent further chaos. Daly delves into how this myth has influenced the treatment of women throughout history, leading to their exclusion from positions of power within religious, social, and political institutions. It has provided a convenient justification for why women should be silent, submissive, and obedient, framing these expectations as moral obligations rather than as tools of oppression. By internalizing this narrative, many women have come to view themselves through a lens of guilt, shame, and inferiority, often believing that their desires, ambitions, or independence are sources of wrongdoing. Another figure Daly examines is the Virgin Mary, who represents the idealized image of womanhood in Christian mythology. The Virgin Mary is revered for her purity, obedience, and self-sacrifice, serving as the ultimate symbol of what a good woman should be. Daly points out that this ideal is deeply problematic because it reduces women to a state of passive, self-denying existence, where their value is measured by their ability to conform to an unrealistic standard of purity and submission. By elevating Mary to a divine status while simultaneously emphasizing her virginity and subservience, the myth effectively discourages women from seeking agency, autonomy, or self-fulfillment. It reinforces the notion that women's worth lies in their ability to serve others, particularly men, rather than in their own self-actualization. Daly's critique extends to post-Christian myths, where she explores how Enlightenment and scientific rationalism have continued to perpetuate patriarchal ideas under the guise of progress and modernity. She scrutinizes how the field of gynecology, which ostensibly aims to care for women's health, has historically been a site of control, experimentation, and violence against women's bodies. For instance, Daly discusses how early gynecological practices were often conducted without anesthesia or consent, reflecting the same disregard for women's autonomy seen in religious myths. These practices were justified under the guise of scientific advancement, yet they echoed the same themes of dominance, objectification, and control present in Christian narratives. Daly's examination reveals how these religious and post-religious myths work together to create a culture that views women as objects to be controlled, manipulated, and defined by external forces. She argues that this dismemberment of female identity has prevented women from seeing themselves as whole, autonomous beings. Instead, women have been conditioned to view themselves in fragmented ways, either as saints or sinners, virgins or whores, nurturers or witches, each role serving to maintain patriarchal power. In concluding this passage, Daly emphasizes that to reclaim their identity, women must reject these oppressive myths and the societal structures that perpetuate them. She encourages women to engage in a process of remembering, where they piece together the fragments of their identity that have been torn apart by patriarchal narratives. This involves not only challenging external myths, but also confronting the internalized beliefs that have been ingrained in women through centuries of religious and cultural conditioning. Through this in-depth exploration of how myths have been weaponized to control women, the first passage of Gynecology serves as a foundational understanding of how patriarchal oppression is deeply rooted in cultural and religious narratives. Daly's work is a call to action, urging women to dismantle these myths, rediscover their true selves, and begin the journey toward liberation. The second passage, the Pseudo-Ritual Syndrome. In this section, Mary Daly introduces the pseudo-ritual syndrome, a term that captures the deliberate, systematic, and often brutal rituals used by patriarchal societies to enforce control over women. Daly explains that these practices are not isolated incidents, but part of a larger, global pattern of institutionalized violence that has persisted across centuries and cultures. These rituals can be seen as symbolic reenactments of the murder of the goddess, a metaphor for the systematic eradication of female power, autonomy, and identity. By examining these practices, Daly reveals how patriarchal societies have historically exerted dominance over women by inflicting pain, suffering, and mutilation, thereby reinforcing male authority and control. Indian Suti. The ritual of sati was a practice in which a widow was expected, or sometimes forced, to immolate herself on her husband's funeral pyre. This act was often glorified as the ultimate demonstration of wifely devotion and purity, reinforcing the idea that a woman's identity and purpose were entirely bound to her husband. If a widow refused to participate in this ritual, she faced social ostracization, disgrace, or even physical coercion to ensure compliance. Daly delves into the symbolism of sati, arguing that it represents the ultimate denial of a woman's autonomy. It reflects the notion that a woman's life ceases to have value once her husband dies, rendering her existence meaningless without a man to define her. This ritual served to reinforce patriarchal values, ensuring that women remained dependent on men, even in death. Sati was not just about physical violence, but about the erasure of female identity, individuality, and autonomy. Daly expands on the historical context, pointing out that sati was often praised and romanticized by society as an act of nobility and honor. This narrative conveniently masked the underlying violence and coercion, making it appear as though women were willingly participating in their own subjugation. In reality, many women were drugged, bound, or physically forced onto the pyre, exposing the brutality of a ritual designed to maintain male dominance. Furthermore, Daly connects sati to broader patriarchal attitudes that persist today. She suggests that while the literal practice of sati has been outlawed, the ideology behind it continues to influence how societies view widowed or unmarried women, often treating them as incomplete or less valuable. The expectation for women to sacrifice themselves, whether physically, emotionally, or economically, in service of men, still echoes in contemporary cultures, making sati a symbol of the broader, enduring patterns of female oppression. Chinese foot-binding. Foot-binding was a practice that began during the Song dynasty, 960 to 1279 AD, and continued for almost 1,000 years, affecting millions of Chinese women. Girls as young as 5 years old would have their feet tightly bound with cloth, breaking the bones and altering the shape to achieve the desired lotus foot, which was typically no longer than 3 to 4 inches. The process was excruciatingly painful, often causing infections, lifelong disabilities, and even death. Daly examines foot-binding as a powerful example of how patriarchal societies have historically manipulated and controlled women's bodies to fit male-defined standards of beauty. Foot-binding was not only about physical control, but also about ensuring women's dependency. Women with bound feet were unable to walk properly or engage in physical labor, confining them to the domestic sphere and making them more reliant on men. This physical confinement served as a metaphor for the broader societal restrictions placed on women, limiting their movement, opportunities, and autonomy. Foot-binding also acted as a marker of status and femininity. Women with bound feet were considered more desirable and marriageable, reinforcing the notion that a woman's worth was tied to her ability to conform to male ideals of beauty and submission. Daly draws parallels between foot-binding and modern beauty standards, highlighting how women continue to be pressured to alter their bodies, whether through cosmetic surgery, dieting, or other means, to fit unrealistic and often painful ideals. Daly's analysis reveals how practices like foot-binding are not simply relics of the past, but ongoing manifestations of patriarchal control over women's bodies. By inflicting pain and deformity, these rituals serve to remind women of their subordinate status and reinforce male authority. Foot-binding, therefore, becomes a symbol of how patriarchal societies demand that women literally and metaphorically reshape themselves to fit into narrow, oppressive definitions of femininity. African genital mutilation. Female genital mutilation, FGM, is a practice that involves the partial or total removal of external female genitalia for non-medical reasons. It is often performed on young girls, usually between infancy and age 15, and is deeply rooted in cultural, religious, or social traditions. Despite being widely condemned by international organizations, FGM continues to affect millions of women and girls across various African countries, the Middle East, and Asia. Daly's exploration of FGM exposes it as one of the most brutal forms of patriarchal control over women's bodies. She argues that FGM is a ritualistic attempt to strip women of their sexual autonomy, pleasure, and agency. By mutilating female genitalia, patriarchal societies aim to diminish women's sexuality, ensuring that it remains under male control and reducing the likelihood of women seeking pleasure outside of the confines of marriage. Daly delves into the cultural justifications for FGM, such as the belief that it preserves a girl's purity, ensures marital fidelity, and enhances a woman's marriage prospects. She emphasizes how these justifications are rooted in the desire to control female sexuality, reinforcing the idea that a woman's body belongs to her future husband rather than to herself. The pain, trauma, and health complications associated with FGM, such as chronic pain, infections, complications during childbirth, and even death, are ignored or minimized, reflecting the patriarchal disregard for women's well-being and autonomy. Daly connects FGM to a broader pattern of controlling women's bodies across different cultures, drawing attention to how patriarchal societies use violence and ritual to enforce their dominance. She highlights that FGM is not just a physical act, but a symbolic one, representing the patriarchal desire to maintain control over women's sexuality and identity. Through this lens, FGM serves as a stark reminder of how deeply ingrained and violent patriarchal practices can be in maintaining female subjugation. European witch burnings. During the 15th to 18th centuries, Europe was gripped by a wave of hysteria that led to the persecution, torture, and execution of tens of thousands of women accused of witchcraft. These women were often scapegoated for societal problems such as crop failures, disease outbreaks, or unexplained events. Accusations of witchcraft were frequently based on little to no evidence, and women were subjected to brutal torture until they confessed, after which they were typically executed by burning at the stake, hanging, or drowning. Daly examines the witch hunts as a targeted attack on women who dared to step outside of the narrow confines of patriarchal expectations. Many of the women accused of witchcraft were healers, midwives, or women who possessed knowledge and skills that threatened male-dominated institutions. By labeling these women as witches, patriarchal societies sought to silence, control, and eliminate those who challenged their authority. Daly argues that the witch hunt served as a form of psychological terrorism, instilling fear in women and reinforcing the idea that any deviation from prescribed gender roles would result in violent punishment. This ritualistic persecution served to suppress female autonomy, creativity, and power, reinforcing the belief that women who resisted patriarchal norms were dangerous, deviant, and deserving of death. Daly draws parallels between the witch hunts and contemporary forms of female persecution, suggesting that women today are still punished for challenging patriarchal norms, albeit in more subtle or institutionalized ways. The legacy of the witch hunts lingers in the ways women are marginalized, dismissed, or demonized when they assert themselves, challenge authority, or defy traditional gender roles. American gynecology. The final example Daly explores is the development of gynecology in the United States, which she presents as a modern manifestation of the pseudo-ritual syndrome. The field of gynecology, which claims to focus on women's health, has its origins in practices that were often brutal, experimental, and non-consensual. J. Marion Sims, known as the father of gynecology, conducted invasive surgical experiments on enslaved black women without anesthesia, rationalizing that black women could endure more pain, a belief rooted in both racism and misogyny. Daly argues that such practices were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern of medicalizing women's bodies to exert control over them. The field of gynecology has historically treated women as objects of study rather than as autonomous beings, reinforcing patriarchal narratives that women's bodies are inherently problematic, flawed, or in need of male intervention. Daly connects this to modern practices such as the overuse of hysterectomies, the medicalization of childbirth, and the pathologization of natural female processes like menstruation and menopause. These practices reflect a continued attempt to control, monitor, and correct women's bodies, often without their full understanding or consent. Conclusion of the Pseudo-Ritual Syndrome. Through her analysis, Daly reveals that the pseudo-ritual syndrome is a pervasive, ongoing strategy used by patriarchal societies to dominate, control, and subjugate women. These rituals, whether ancient or modern, serve to remind women of their supposed inferiority, enforcing compliance through pain, fear, and violence. Daly's work challenges women to confront these practices, recognize their deep roots in patriarchal oppression, and begin the process of reclaiming their bodies, autonomy, and power. The third passage, Gynecology, Spinning New Time and Space. In this final and transformative passage, Mary Daly shifts from examining the ways in which patriarchy oppresses and controls women to envisioning a radical path forward, a journey of reclaiming, redefining, and celebrating female identity, power, and creativity. Daly introduces the idea of spinning, a process of weaving a new reality where women are no longer confined by patriarchal norms, but instead create their own time-space, where they can exist freely, authentically, and powerfully. This section is about constructing a female-centric universe, one that is rooted in women's experiences, values, and visions. Daly's notion of spinning is not just an act of rebellion against patriarchy, but a deliberate and conscious act of creation, where women take on the role of spinsters who actively shape their own destinies. By spinning, women reject the limiting narratives imposed on them by patriarchal societies and instead create their own stories, symbols, and meanings that honor their true selves. This act of creation is not only empowering, but is also a form of resistance against the structures that have silenced and diminished women for centuries. Chapter 8: Spooking, Exorcism, Escape, and Inspiriting Process. The concept of spooking represents the first crucial step in the journey toward liberation and self-discovery. It involves the process of exorcising patriarchal influences that have infiltrated women's minds, bodies, and spirits, often without them even realizing it. Daly uses the term spooking to emphasize that this process is akin to confronting and banishing ghosts, those internalized beliefs, values, and expectations that have been instilled by patriarchal systems. Daly draws on the idea of exorcism to convey the seriousness and intensity required for this process. Exorcism, in this context, is about identifying and uprooting the deep-seated fears, insecurities, and self-doubts that have been implanted in women through patriarchal conditioning. For example, women may have internalized the belief that their worth is tied to their physical appearance, their ability to nurture others, or their capacity to conform to societal expectations of femininity. These beliefs act as invisible chains, limiting women's ability to explore their true potential. Daly emphasizes that exorcism is not a passive act. It requires active engagement, introspection, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about how one's identity has been shaped by external forces. This might involve recognizing how patriarchal myths have influenced one's self-perception, such as believing that one must always be self-sacrificing, demure, or dependent on male validation. By naming and confronting these internalized influences, women can begin to reclaim their sense of self and break free from the psychological barriers that have held them captive. The escape aspect of spooking involves physically and emotionally distancing oneself from environments, relationships, or institutions that perpetuate patriarchal control. Daly encourages women to assess their lives and identify areas where they feel constrained, manipulated, or devalued. This could mean leaving abusive relationships, rejecting oppressive religious doctrines, or challenging workplace dynamics that undermine women's authority and contributions. It's about creating boundaries and spaces where one can exist without being subjected to patriarchal expectations. The final element, inspiriting, is about reconnecting with one's inner strength, creativity, and spirituality. Daly argues that patriarchal societies have sought to disconnect women from their spiritual selves, often by denying them access to forms of worship, knowledge, or practices that honor female divinity. By engaging in the process of inspiriting, women can reclaim their sense of power and autonomy, tapping into the wisdom and vitality that reside within them. Daly encourages women to explore their own spiritual paths, whether through reconnecting with nature, engaging in creative expression, or cultivating relationships that nurture their souls. Spooking is, therefore, a multidimensional process that requires women to confront, reject, and ultimately transcend the patriarchal influences that have shaped their lives. It is an act of courage, a declaration of independence, and the first step toward building a new, liberated reality. Chapter 9. Sparking: The Fire of Female Friendship. In this chapter, Daly emphasizes the transformative power of female friendships and sisterhood as essential elements in the journey toward liberation. Sparking refers to the energy, warmth, and inspiration that arise when women come together in authentic, supportive relationships. Daly argues that patriarchal societies have systematically worked to isolate women, fostering competition, jealousy, and distrust to prevent them from forming strong bonds. This isolation ensures that women remain divided, making it easier for patriarchal systems to maintain control. Daly celebrates the idea of female friendship as a form of resistance, a radical act that defies the patriarchal mandate that women must always be rivals or enemies. She believes that when women connect with each other on a deep, genuine level, they ignite a spark that has the power to transform their lives and the world around them. These friendships become spaces of healing, empowerment, and creativity, where women can freely share their experiences, wisdom, and dreams without fear of judgment or repression. Sparking is about recognizing the power that lies in female solidarity. It means understanding that women's shared experiences of oppression can become the foundation for building connections that uplift and empower. Daly argues that by forming strong, supportive bonds, women can challenge the patriarchal narratives that seek to divide them, creating a sense of community that nurtures growth, resilience, and self-acceptance. Daly provides examples of how female friendships can serve as catalysts for change. For instance, she discusses how women who collaborate in movements for social justice, environmental activism, or artistic expression can create powerful waves of change that disrupt patriarchal systems. These connections allow women to draw strength from one another, amplifying their voices and expanding their influence. She also emphasizes the importance of reclaiming the concept of sisterhood, which has often been dismissed or ridiculed by patriarchal cultures. Sisterhood, in Daly's vision, is not just about being friends. It is about recognizing a shared sense of purpose, destiny, and interconnectedness. It is about understanding that every woman's liberation is tied to the liberation of all women, and that by supporting one another, women can collectively dismantle the structures that oppress them. Chapter 10. Spinning: Cosmic Tapestries. The final chapter, Spinning, represents the culmination of Daly's vision for female liberation and empowerment. Here, she introduces the idea of spinning as the act of creating a new reality, one that is based on female experiences, values, and creativity. Spinning is both a literal and metaphorical process, drawing from the ancient practice of spinning thread to create fabric. Daly uses this imagery to suggest that women have the power to weave their own cosmic tapestries, crafting a universe that honors their existence, stories, and wisdom. Daly's concept of spinning encourages women to reject patriarchal narratives and instead create their own language, symbols, and stories that reflect their unique perspectives and experiences. This involves reclaiming language that has been used to oppress women, redefining it in ways that empower and uplift. For example, words like witch, hag, or spinster, which have historically been used to marginalize women, can be reclaimed and transformed into symbols of female strength, wisdom, and autonomy. Spinning also involves creating new rituals, traditions, and spaces that celebrate women's bodies, minds, and spirits. Daly envisions a world where women gather to share their stories, support each other's growth, and celebrate their achievements. This could take the form of women's circles, creative workshops, spiritual gatherings, or activist movements that center around female empowerment and expression. Importantly, Daly emphasizes that spinning is not a one-time act but an ongoing process. It is about embracing fluidity, change, and evolution, recognizing that women's experiences and identities are dynamic and multifaceted. This process allows women to continually reinvent themselves, exploring new possibilities, paths, and expressions of their identity. Conclusion of the third passage: creating a new reality. In this final passage, Daly presents a vision of liberation that is both radical and expansive. She challenges women to move beyond the limitations imposed by patriarchal structures and to actively participate in the creation of a new, female-centric reality. Her message is one of hope, empowerment, and possibility, urging women to reclaim their power, connect with each other, and create a world that celebrates their experiences, strengths, and potential. Through spooking, sparking, and spinning, Daly offers a roadmap for women to break free from the constraints of patriarchy and to embark on a journey of self-discovery, connection, and creation. This passage is a call to action, an invitation for women to take charge of their destinies and to weave a reality that is rooted in female wisdom, creativity, and solidarity. By engaging in this process, women can create a new time-space where they are no longer defined by patriarchal standards, but are instead celebrated for their individuality, strength, and potential. Daly's vision is not just about personal liberation, but about the collective creation of a world where women can live, thrive, and express themselves without fear, limitation, or oppression. Major themes: patriarchal oppression. One of the central themes of gynecology is Daly's comprehensive critique of how patriarchal oppression manifests across cultures, institutions, and history. Daly argues that patriarchy is not merely a collection of individual acts of sexism, but a deeply entrenched systemic force that pervades every aspect of society. She demonstrates how patriarchal control extends to religion, medicine, language, mythology, and cultural practices, working to maintain male dominance and suppress female power. For example, Daly examines how religious traditions across different cultures have portrayed women as subordinate, sinful, or in need of male guidance. The biblical story of Eve, which presents woman as the original source of sin, is one such myth that has been used to justify women's oppression for centuries. Similarly, Daly explores how medical institutions have historically pathologized women's bodies, treating natural processes like menstruation, childbirth, and menopause as illnesses that require male intervention and control. These examples highlight how patriarchy imposes limitations on women's autonomy, defining them in relation to men and positioning them as inherently inferior. By exposing the ways in which patriarchal oppression is woven into the fabric of society, Daly challenges her readers to recognize that these systems are not natural or inevitable. They are constructed and perpetuated to maintain male power. Understanding this theme is crucial for recognizing the broader patterns of oppression and the necessity of dismantling them in order to achieve true liberation. The reclamation of female power. Another major theme in gynecology is the reclamation of female power, which Daly sees as an essential step in the journey toward liberation. Daly argues that women have been systematically stripped of their power, autonomy, and spirituality through patriarchal myths, rituals, and institutions. However, she also believes that women possess an innate strength and creativity that can be rediscovered and reclaimed. Daly emphasizes the importance of reconnecting with the goddess archetype, a symbol of female divinity, wisdom, and power that predates patriarchal religions. By reconnecting with this aspect of themselves, women can begin to shed the layers of conditioning that have kept them subservient and reclaim their spiritual, emotional, and intellectual autonomy. This process of reclamation involves rejecting patriarchal definitions of femininity, beauty, and worth, and instead embracing an identity that is self-defined and rooted in one's own experiences, desires, and values. To illustrate this theme, Daly points to historical examples of female healers, shamans, and wise women who were persecuted as witches by patriarchal societies. These women, who represented a threat to male dominance, were often the keepers of knowledge, power, and spiritual wisdom. By reclaiming this legacy, Daly encourages women to honor their own inner strength and wisdom, rejecting the narratives that have sought to diminish them. This theme is not just about individual empowerment, but also about the collective reclamation of female power. Daly envisions a world where women come together to create new rituals, communities, and ways of being that honor their experiences, creativity, and strength. It is through this process that women can begin to dismantle the structures of patriarchy and create a reality that celebrates and uplifts the feminine. Language and myth. Language and myth play a crucial role in Daly's analysis of how patriarchy exerts control over women and how it can be challenged and transformed. Daly argues that language is not a neutral tool, but a powerful instrument used by patriarchy to shape reality, define women's roles, and reinforce male dominance. Throughout history, language has been used to silence women, distort their experiences, and confine them to narrowly defined roles. For instance, Daly critiques how patriarchal language often objectifies women, reducing them to their physical attributes or roles in relation to men, for example, wife, mother, mistress. Words and phrases that describe women's bodies, behaviors, and identities are frequently imbued with negative connotations, reinforcing the idea that women are inferior, passive, or incomplete. Daly points out that even the word woman itself contains man, suggesting that women's existence is secondary to and defined by men. Daly's exploration of myth follows a similar trajectory. She argues that patriarchal societies have constructed myths, stories, religious narratives, cultural symbols that serve to justify and perpetuate male dominance. Myths such as the story of Eve, the femme fatale, or the virgin-whore dichotomy create powerful narratives that shape how women are perceived and treated, both by themselves and by society. These myths become internalized, causing women to accept and perpetuate their own oppression. However, Daly also sees the potential for language and myth to be reclaimed and reimagined as tools of empowerment. She encourages women to spin new words, stories, and symbols that reflect their experiences, strengths, and identities. This involves challenging and deconstructing patriarchal language, refusing to use words that demean or diminish women, and instead creating a new vocabulary that honors female power, creativity, and diversity. For example, Daly reclaims terms such as hag, witch, and crone, which have traditionally been used to insult and marginalize women, and transforms them into symbols of female wisdom, strength, and independence. By doing so, she demonstrates how language can be a tool of resistance and liberation, enabling women to redefine themselves on their own terms. The theme of language and myth highlights the power of storytelling and self-expression in the fight against patriarchy. It emphasizes that by reclaiming the power to name themselves and their experiences, women can begin to reshape their reality and challenge the narratives that have kept them oppressed. In essence, these three themes, patriarchal oppression, the reclamation of female power, and language and myth, are interconnected strands of Daly's argument. Together, they reveal how patriarchy maintains its hold over women, how women can rediscover and reclaim their inherent power, and how language and myth can be both tools of oppression and instruments of liberation. Understanding these themes is central to grasping Daly's vision for a radical transformation of society, where women can finally break free from the chains of patriarchy and create a world that honors their experiences, identities, and power. Legacy and impact. Mary Daly's Gynecology has left an indelible mark on radical feminist thought, serving as one of the most influential and provocative works of its time. Its impact can be seen in how it shaped discussions around patriarchy, language, spirituality, and the reclamation of female power, inspiring generations of feminists to challenge and resist oppressive structures. Influence on radical feminism. Gynecology became a cornerstone of radical feminist theory by introducing new ways of thinking about the roots of patriarchy and the importance of reclaiming female identity and autonomy. Daly's bold critique of patriarchal institutions, myths, and language encouraged women to question societal norms and reject the roles that had been imposed on them. Her emphasis on the Metapatriarchal Journey provided a framework for understanding how deeply embedded patriarchy is in culture, religion, and everyday life, and her call for women to create their own spaces, languages, and rituals resonated with many who were searching for a more radical path to liberation. The book's exploration of how patriarchy manifests across different cultures and historical periods expanded the scope of feminist analysis, encouraging women to consider the global and cross-cultural dimensions of oppression. Daly's challenge to the dominance of male-defined language and her encouragement for women to spin their own narratives were revolutionary ideas that have been incorporated into feminist movements, literature, and discussions about reclaiming agency over one's identity. Continued relevance. The themes of gynecology remain relevant today, as the struggle against patriarchy continues in different forms. Daly's exploration of how language can be used as a tool of oppression or empowerment is still pertinent in a world where debates about gendered language, representation, and identity persist. Movements like the Me Too movement and ongoing discussions about women's autonomy, reproductive rights, and body positivity echo Daly's call for women to reclaim their voices and bodies. Conclusion. At its core, gynecology is a powerful call for women to reclaim their power, voice, and identity. Mary Daly's message encourages women to reject the limitations imposed by patriarchal society, to confront the myths and language that have been used to define them, and to embark on a journey of self-discovery, empowerment, and transformation. By inviting women to engage in the processes of spooking, sparking, and spinning, Daly challenges us to envision a world where female creativity, wisdom, and strength are at the forefront. Her legacy reminds us that the journey toward liberation is both an individual and collective endeavor, requiring courage, solidarity, and a willingness to redefine what it means to be a woman in a world that often seeks to diminish and control us. Gynecology continues to inspire women to break free from patriarchal constraints, to reclaim their narratives, and to create a future that honors their unique experiences, power, and potential.